That's where we started the series. We started it with the wrestling match of faith that all of us go through, that define God's people as Jacob wrestled with God. And what this shows us is that faith it's not an unshakable psychological certainty, but faith is a wrestling match. Faith is a wrestling match in which we engage with God. And faith can be and is shaken. Faith gets thrown around in our struggle of wrestling through experiences as natural creatures, attempting to also understand and perceive the supernatural. And life is troublesome. It rejects many cliches. Through our life, experiences can and experiences should bring us to question all kinds of things, doubt all kinds of things, experience fear and stress and struggle, because these are the things that initiate growth and maturity and change. If I don't stress about something, if I don't fear something, if I don't doubt something, I'm never going to move from it onto something else. And so faith has to wrestle. Faith has to be shaken. And what we hold on to in this faith, in the wrestling match, is God. It's the God of agape love. It's the God who is agape love. And it's the God who I believe was revealed to us fully in Jesus. So then last week we considered, what do we do with all of the stuff in the Old Testament that is attributed to God? Many people struggle that it seems to contradict Jesus and the God of Jesus. And there's numerous views on a spectrum of how to deal with this, and people wrestle with it. People look at the spectrum of views and they wrestle, and they come up with various ways to read it that make sense to them where they are right now in their relationship with God and where He's brought them. As I've wrestled over the last decade plus, I've come to land in the camp of Archbishop Lazar, who says, every scripture that claims to be a revelation of God must bow to the living God when He came in the flesh. I offered you the view that what we actually see in the Old Testament is a progression and an understanding who God is and what He's really saying. And at the right time in this progression, God came in the flesh of Jesus. Scripture calls it the fullness of time. And Jesus is the culmination of what the Old Testament has been all about. And Jesus begins to settle just exactly what that means, that the Old Testament pointed to Him. We saw the example of burnt offerings. Leviticus tells us that God required the burnt offerings and sacrifices. But then a trend began to emerge. Did God really want this? Did He really tell us to do this? David begins to write in the Psalms about how God didn't require these things. Hosea echoes this, and we considered Jeremiah 7:22, where he flat out records God saying, in the day I brought you out of Egypt, you thought you heard me give you rules about burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I did not speak to you about those things. So there seems to be a problem, two conflicting views. Leviticus on one side, progressing to Hosea, who sides with David and Jeremiah on the other side. And along comes Jesus. And He says, you better read Hosea. Better get to know what Hosea meant. We look at more of the problems last week, and I offered to you that Scripture, it is inspired and truthful, and it doesn't fail to do what it's meant to do. I read Scripture as a brutally honest, often embarrassing look at the progression of God's people in trying to grow in knowing Him. It's a recording where they got it wrong along the way and they did horrible things in God's name, including killing God Himself in God's name. And we have this entire journey of humanity through history leading up to Jesus to show that God has not given up on his creation. He will not. Instead, Scripture points to God as a patient, loving, suffering servant to his creation who patiently brings us along despite our faults and despite our failures to get it right. And as we read this through the Old Testament, it points to God exactly as Jesus revealed him to be. Over the time of the Old Testament and into our day, we see the progression of God's people and getting to know who God is, and it takes time. It takes time because, like we see with Jacob, God will not beat us down into submission. Scripture says that God could not win against Jacob in the wrestling match. But God's agape. And agape love does not force its will. It does not crush someone into submission under it. Agape love engages with us, and it wins us over through patient love and forgiveness. One theologian put the progression of the Bible this way: what the Bible brings to us is how God's love wins. God supremely values authentic agape love relationships. And because he does not want to dehumanize people, he relies on influence rather than coercive power to accomplish his purposes. Only gradually could God change people's hearts and minds so that they could receive more and more truth about his character and about his ideal will for them. What this means is that there are going to be contradictions in Scripture. Scripture is going to wrestle against itself because we humans are wrestling with ourselves. To understand this idea a little bit, we are going to jump into the Book of Ruth and see just how does this play out in the Old Testament. So the Book of Ruth, the originator of the story of Ruth is actually unknown. We don't know who came up with the story. It is interesting, though, due to the insight that the story holds into women's lives and women's perspectives, many scholars have considered that evidence lends itself to a woman coming to tell the story of Ruth. If this is the case, then not only what we are going to find in the book of Ruth is Scripture wrestling with Scripture, but we are going to read from a brave woman writing Scripture to wrestle against men in authority in a patriarchal society. Now, to truly enjoy the story, though, it's important to understand its background and its setting. And so what we need to consider is that the book of Ruth has two settings. Ruth, in the story, she finds herself set within the time period of the Judges. We'll say 1200-ish BC. But we know that the story originates much later, and it is to that late setting that we take a closer view. The year is 450 BC. It's a nice round number. It's about when we would guess it was written. Over a century has passed since Babylon destroyed Jerusalem with its temple and carried the Jewish people off to captivity. Now under Persian rule, for about 3/4 of a century, the Jewish people have been returning, trickling in back to Jerusalem from where they were ushered out to in captivity. And they've managed to rebuild the temple. And they're getting settled. At the time of our story, the temple has been rebuilt for a few decades now. It's been finished for a few decades. And Nehemiah, a highly placed Jew in the Persian Empire, along with Ezra, a high-ranking priest, they have come to do two things. Rebuild the city wall, which in those days was its defenses, and renew the people to separate from the Gentiles and reclaim the purity of the Torah. They need to get back in contact with the law of Moses and the blessings of God that it brings. One very concerning Gentile group that plays a role in the story are the Moabites. The Moabites lived just to the east of where the Jews were rebuilding Jerusalem. And the Moabites were so hated, they had no entry into God's people. Deuteronomy 23:3 tells us, "No Moabite shall come into the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall come into the assembly of the Lord forever." Deuteronomy 23:6 goes on to say, "You shall never even promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live." This is a big deal. You cannot be part of God's people if you are even less than 1% Moabite at this point. If you're down 10 generations from a single Moabite, you are out. So here come Ezra and Nehemiah to Jerusalem, ready to renew the purity of the people. And they find Israelite men who have intermarried with Moabite women. Uh-oh. Let's hear what Ezra and Nehemiah have to say about what happens. Nehemiah says in Nehemiah 13, verse 1, "On that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God." Going on to Nehemiah 13, verses 23 through 25, it says, "In those days, also I," this is Nehemiah, "saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the language of various people. And I contended with them and cursed them and beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, 'You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourself.'" Nehemiah is pretty passionate about getting holy. He's like, guys, we're getting right with God. So there. We're going to put a stop to the breaking of this law from the Lord. No more marriages with Moabite men or women. But we have a problem. What about those who are already married and have birthed families? For the chosen solution, we're going to go to the book of Ezra. Ezra chapter 10, verse 7 through 8. "They made a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem to all the returned exiles." These are all the returned Jews that came out of captivity. "That they should assemble at Jerusalem, and that if any did not come within 3 days, by order of the officials and the elders, all their property should be forfeited, and they themselves banned from the congregation of the exiles." They are serious about this. They're calling the Jews together from the area, and you better come or else we're just going to kick you out. So the people gather. And we go on to Ezra chapter 10, verses 10 to 11. "Then Ezra, the priest, stood up and said to them, 'You have trespassed and married foreign women, and so increased the guilt of Israel. We are being punished because of what you have done. Now make confession to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the people of the land and from the foreign wives.'" There's the solution. Dump your Moabite wives. Kick them out. And what we're going to find is that all the kids are kicked out too. Ezra closes with a list of 117 men who intermarried with Moabite women. There's a running list at the book of Ezra. In Ezra 10, verse 44, it closes the book of Ezra with this: "All these had married foreign women, and they sent them away with their children. It sounds clean. It sounds sterile. We're getting back to holiness. There is a passion for God. We are doing this, and we kick them out, and boom, the problem is fixed. Israel is returning to the commands of God. Chalk one up for holiness. It sounds simple. But you know it really wasn't that simple. Can you imagine the emotion, the spectacle of this moment? Pushing away wives who don't know where they're going to live as a single mom in a patriarchal society. Unraveling your crying half Moabite son or daughter from holding onto your leg to be like, you got to go. They don't understand why they're being kicked out. How many men do you think refused to send their family away and were held down by their neighbors while their neighbors kicked their wives and sons out? Because we're being punished by God. We got to clean this country up. How many people silently watched the anger, the sadness playing out and thought, somebody's got to do something? Well, somebody did. The someone, though, did not attempt to meet mob violent mentality with violence. Meeting violence with violence plays into the cycle of the world, especially when a mob is involved. Several weeks ago, we talked about the mob mentality. Instead, the someone who acted decides to write a love story. Someone decided to write the story of Ruth, a story that cannot coexist in harmony with either the law of Deuteronomy or the holy, zealous actions of Ezra and Nehemiah. The Book of Ruth is a counter voice of protest. Modern scholars are only just now coming to truly appreciate Ruth's intentional challenge to the Deuteronomic law. The Book of Ruth, it comes eloquently, disarmingly, to counter religious aggression and religious violence. It pushes back on the zealous, destructive actions of Ezra and Nehemiah. It also places itself contextually in the time of the Judges. This is a period of history drenched in blood and holy zeal. The book of Judges is full of religious violence. And the book of Ruth places itself in the same time period with zero violence, zero bad guys, and a story of love. But Pastor, that sounds boring. Where's the suspense and the tension and the anticipation? There's no bad guys? There's no violence? These are the things that make a good dramatic story. What's interesting is if you pause, there are bad guys. There is tension. The bad guys are the target audience of reading Ruth. The story is going to fight against the bad guys, but rather than turn to violence to force an external change, the book is going to turn to love, a love story. And it's going to seek to subconsciously turn the minds and hearts of the people, just like Jesus does when he points to the faith of a Canaanite mother, just like Jesus does when he tells of the goodness of a Samaritan. The story is going to seek to change hearts and minds. So let's dive into this beautiful, inspired story. Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab. He and his wife had 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Right away, the richness of the story builds. But to catch it, it helps to have a little decoder tool. We have a separation of time and culture from this book being written. And so we need a little decoder. So here's our decoder as we go through the story. For those watching online, actually, I did also put the decoding into the comments of the YouTube video, so you can see what we're seeing here. We're going to keep this up as we investigate the story. So the story begins, it places us geographically in Judah, the place where Ezra and Nehemiah are purging Moabite blood from the land. And we zoom in from Judah, we zoom into Bethlehem, Hebrew for the house of food. But there's no food to be had in the house of food. We zoom in a bit further and focus on a single family. The father is named God is King. The wife and mother is named Pleasant. And the 2 children are in this family. They're named Sickly and Frail. For those who know the story or have since read it, since I mentioned it, you may begin to see the setup for what is ahead. So we see this family and we're introduced to their plight. There is a famine and it forces them to head to the land of Moab. They are forced to go seek support in the midst of one of Israel's most hated enemies, where apparently there is plenty of food and refugees know they can go there. Apparently, God is blessing the Moabites, even though God's people know they're to be despised. There are hints upon hints upon hints as the story even first begins. This Israelite family is able to come as immigrants and they are allowed to live in Moab. They make a living. They settle down. Then something bad happens. Elimelech dies. Being a widow in the ancient world was a horrible state to be in. You are fully and utterly dependent upon society. But it's a good thing for Naomi that she now has 2 adult sons to support her. Over the years, they're in Moab, and the sons meet some nice women in town. And they marry 2 Moabite women. The youngest son, Chilion, he marries a wonderful Moabite woman named Orpah. Orpah means nape, or the back of the neck, the nape of the neck. And the oldest son, Mahlon, he marries the beautiful Moabite woman, Ruth, who our story is named after. The name Ruth means friendship or companion. So now, in our story, Pleasant is a widow. Her son, Frail, has married Nape, and her son, Sickly, has married Friendship. And there's still hope that things will work out. Grandkids will be coming, and everything will be okay. But we know what's coming. Our excellent storyteller has foreshadowed what's about to happen. Mahlon and Chilion are struck down. Sickly and Frail die. And the author pulls at our heartstrings in the way that they word our story. When Naomi loses her husband, the author tells us that Naomi was left with her sons. In other words, Naomi was left with hope. But then the sons die. And poetically, the author tells us then, Naomi was left without her sons. Hope was gone. Hope is gone, and the little family that left Bethlehem only has Naomi left. Naomi, though, is one of a new family composed entirely of widows. What are they going to do? Naomi hears that food has returned to the house of food. The famine is over, and she has family back in Bethlehem. So she starts out with her daughters-in-law, to return to where our story first started. But apparently, partway there, Naomi thinks, the heck am I doing dragging these young women with me? She may have even anticipated what they would have faced as Moabites when she brings them back to the land of Judah. And she tells them, go home to your families, go home to your gods. I have nothing for you. And this becomes an emotional moment. And we're told in the book of Ruth that in the middle of them crying, in the middle of them talking, Orpah relents to Naomi's advice. She kisses Naomi goodbye, and she walks home. She's not a traitor. She's not a bad person. There is no bad choice here. There is no evil choice here. There was a new family waiting ahead in Bethlehem. But Naomi had also declared blessings on the women, as she released them to go back to Moab. So Orpah walks away from Naomi and into blessings. And the last we see of Orpah in this story is the nape of her neck as she walks away. But friendship stands fast. Ruth, it says, clings to Naomi. I love this story because you can feel it. And Ruth will not let go. Ruth declares in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, do not press me to leave you, to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. This is one of the most amazing, beautiful poems of loyal friendship. It's beautiful. It's amazing. And Ruth tells this to Naomi, and Naomi relents. So Orpah goes one way, and Ruth goes the other. In the split, we get to experience the reality of the complex emotions that would have been going on. We're given depth to these characters. Naomi, she didn't really want to be left alone when she tells Orpah and Ruth to leave her. But she also wants what's best for her daughters-in-law. And Orpah and Ruth are caught in the middle of a very difficult choice: to return to safety or to press on. And Orpah makes a good, wise choice. And Ruth makes a good, loyal choice as Ruth heads off with Naomi. In Ruth's statements and movements, it has not gone unnoticed the intent with which the author of the Book of Ruth is placing Ruth in the shoes of Abraham. Ruth is on a loyal, faithful pilgrimage, heading from east to west to the promised land and a new God. So we are watching a new journey of Abraham here. So Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem. Naomi has not been there for 10 years now. But despite the years of age and stress upon her appearance, people look and they think they know her. And somebody finally says, "Pleasant? Is that really you?" And Naomi responds, "My name is no longer Pleasant, but Bitter. Call me Mara. Call me Bitter. I left here full. About 10 years ago when I left Bethlehem, I left full." No, you didn't. You left starving in a famine in search of food. You did not leave full. But Pleasant was an optimist who loved family. And she left full. Because no matter how hungry she was, if all she had with her was her family, she was full. She left full. But now she's the last one left of that family unit that had filled her life. So Naomi says, "I left here full, but by the hand of the Lord, he has returned me to you empty, and I am bitter." There's a lot to explore here, and we aren't going to get to explore it all. But what we know that Naomi does not know in this moment is that this is only the first quarter of a 4-chapter story. Naomi thinks she knows how her story ends. And this is the lesson I'll leave you with for today. As long as you're breathing, as much as you believe you are empty and bitter, as convinced as you are that even God must be set against you, don't presume to know that your story is over. I've been there. This chapter, it speaks to my life. Perhaps more than any other chapter in Scripture. Stories aren't over. So here we end chapter 1 of the story of Ruth. Ruth, chapter 1, verse 22. So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Ruth has accompanied an empty Naomi, who is now Mara and bitter. She has accompanied her to the house of food just in time for the barley harvest.